Welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 147. And we're in a slightly unusual location today because we've had a power outage, and so I can't film in my studio, which I normally do. Anyway, this time I'm going to talk about Bobbi Humphrey's third album, her first album with the Mizell brothers from 1973, Blacks and Blues. And what I have here is a 1974 fairly early reissue. This, as I mentioned, is her first collaboration with the Mizell brothers, Phonse and Larry, and it takes her in a whole different direction. It takes her in the direction of their work, which is basically lush, funky jazz, all the hallmarks of their style. As a consequence, just like the work that the Mizells did with people like Donald Byrd, Johnny Hammond Smith, and so on, this is as much a Mizell brothers record as it is a record of the leader, and that's no reflection on her, it's just a reflection on how all-encompassing their style was and their stable of musicians. So Bobbi Humphrey was born in Marlin, Texas in 1950, and she was raised in Dallas. Growing up, she received musical training in both classical and jazz, and she was a big fan growing up of Herbie Mann, of course, probably the best-known jazz flute player of the 1950s and 60s, who also, and this is quite significant for this record and for this move in her career, was a big fan of crossover activity. Mann himself did all kinds of bossa nova crossover work, soul jazz crossovers, and so on. After graduation, Bobbi Humphrey went to Texas Southern University and then to Southern Methodist University. And it's at Southern Methodist, after one of her performances, that she meets Dizzy Gillespie, who had caught the show. And they got to chatting, and he encourages her to move to New York City, which she duly does in June 1971. She gets into the swing of things pretty quickly in New York. She performs an amateur night at the Apollo, starts to get a good reputation based on the gigs she's doing, and she ends up getting signed, the very first woman ever to sign as a solo artist, to Blue Note. And one of the first things that happens after she's signed is she's brought in to work with Lee Morgan on what would prove to be his very last album before he's killed by his partner in a bar the following year. And Morgan in turn contributes to her debut album, Flute In, on Blue Note, which comes out at the very end of 1971. One more tidbit from around this time is that she does this appearance on The Tonight Show, where ostensibly she's part of the audience. And Johnny was doing this thing at that particular point called Stump the Band, where you had to basically propose a song to Doc Severinsen's band, and could they play it or couldn't they? Anyway, she's picked out of the audience. She suggests a song. I'm not sure what song it is. They end up playing it, but she has a flute with her, and she ends up playing along with the band. Probably a plant, but kind of a nice story. I'd mentioned her first album for Blue Note, which was Flute In. In 1972, she put out another album, again, straight-ahead jazz, called Dig This. Both of these records, now but also back then, were well-reviewed critically, but neither did very much in terms of sales. Humphrey was disappointed, but she was also aware of other things going on at her own label, in Blue Note, where Donald Byrd in particular was producing some cutting-edge stuff with the Mizell brothers, which also crossed over very neatly and in a very commercially viable way into the funk world. So she seeks out the Mizell brothers, and this is their very first collaboration. It also tells you a little bit about where Blue Note was going in the early part of the 1970s. They had been sold to Liberty Records in 1965. Alfred Lyon, the founder, had retired in 1967, and Francis Wolff, who was part of the real 1-2 punch with Lyon all the way through those classic albums that Blue Note put out in the 60s, dies in 1971. Blue Note puts the reins in the hands of a guy called George Butler, and his brief is pretty simple. Reverse the downward slide in sales, let's do some crossover work, let's branch out to the pop world, which of course was happening in so much of jazz with fusion and funk and so on, and let's turn the ship around. When this album came out, most traditional jazz fans were not that keen on it. Most traditional jazz fans, read white guys, were not that keen on the direction that Blue Note had been taking since their 60s heyday, moving much more towards fusion and funk. It went to number 18 in the Billboard 200, sold a whole bunch of copies, and it was her first real success. This album was recorded June 6th, 7th, and 8th, 1973 at the Sound Factory in Hollywood. The engineer was Chuck Davis, who also ends up singing backup on some of these tunes, and Larry Mizell was the producer. Larry Mizell also writes all of the songs, as was typical of a Mizell production. He and his brother Phonse were probably second only to Gamble and Huff in terms of having an impact on 1970s funk music as a production team. They had a string of highly rated and very successful funk and disco albums all the way through the 1970s. Like Huff and Gamble over at Philadelphia International Records, they also had a house band. In particular, Harvey Mason on drums and Chuck Rainey on bass were the backbone of almost every Mizell's record. Other players that were key were Jerry Peters on piano, Freddie Perrin, who appears on this record on synthesizer and vocals. He did a lot of funk and disco work in the 1970s for people like Peaches and Herb, Yvonne Elliman, Gloria Gaynor, and Tavares. David T. Walker was a longtime session guy as well as a solo artist. He played on albums by Freddie Hubbard, Alphonse Mouzon, Crusaders, basically a jazz funk who's who. John Rowan, the other guitarist, had a similar pedigree. Stephanie Spruill was a percussionist. She did a lot of work with Donald Byrd, And finally, not least because he has such a prominent role here, I have to mention King Arison, who played congas with all kinds of people. Grant Green, David Clayton Thomas, Cannonball Adderley, Etta James, Seals and Crofts, all kinds of people, all kinds of genres. The Mizelles had a real system down. Larry, as I mentioned, had written all the songs. They would get into the studio, they would play the track, they would introduce Bobbi to the track, and then basically Larry would say, just play over top of it, just improvise. There was no real work done with her on her lines. She was just left to interpret the music, which she does fantastically. And what you get in this album are a whole bunch of killer tracks, which largely just come off the top of her head. As I mentioned, this album was really successful, particularly for a jazz album at the time, and particularly for a Blue Note album. And she ends up working with the Mizelles for her two next albums, Satin Doll, which came out in 1974, and Fancy Dancer the following year. Probably the two best tracks on this record are the first two tracks on side one. The first of those is Chicago Dam, which starts with a kind of sound effect of a whistling wind in a cold Chicago winter. You've got a synthy sounding bass riff, and then you've got a vocal verse, and the vocals here are handled by the Mizelles and also by Freddie Perrin. And there's quite a lot of backing vocals here. In fact, the so-called backing vocals are more frequent on the record than Bobbi's own vocals herself, which only occur on two particular tracks. At this point, Bobbi comes in her flute over top of Harvey Mason's beats with a beautiful, clear tone. Her tone is just wonderful all the way through the record. And for the rest of this track, she's basically alternating with Perrin's synths. This is a really great groove and a really great song, classic of the genre. And classic of the genre is a phrase that you really have to apply to the very next song, Harlem River Drive, which has been covered by a whole bunch of folks. It's got that stupendous riff, that wonderful descending and rising bass riff. It is, amongst other things, one of the great New York songs of all time. As I mentioned, it's been covered by a bunch of people. If you're seeking out covers of it, I think the very best one that I've ever heard is one by an acid jazz outfit from the mid-90s called Marden Hill, who I think only ever did one record, and I have to kind of research them a bit more, but their cover of this song is excellent. But covers notwithstanding, for me, the original is thrilling. The last song on side one, which is an incredibly strong album side, is Just a Love Child. And this has a magnificent bass line, and thankfully, it's beautifully audible in the mix for those of you who just love to zone out on the bass, and I put myself in that category. The song is also notable because it's Bobbi Humphrey's singing debut. She's got a great soul voice. She'd never sung in any real capacity prior to making this record. The Mizelles, of course, do back up, and then subsequent to that, you get another great Bobbi Humphrey flute solo. The song, I think, is a little bit overwhelmed by the backing vocals at times. Sometimes the Mizelles, I think, are just a little too confident of the value that they're adding to the record, and they should probably let the leader shine a bit more. That's true of some of the other records they do with Bird and with Hammond as well. But still, overall, a brilliant album side, like I mentioned. Side two starts with Blacks and Blues, which has a really delicious bass line and some very nice work from Jerry Peters on piano as well. Then there's contributions from Perrin on synth, and Bobbi, of course, comes in on flute. There's a period of unison between the instruments and the voices with the Mizelles singing the melody. Overall, the effect of this song is airy and open. The second song on side two is Jasper Countryman, which is probably the funkiest cut in the album, and I think is a pretty underappreciated tune. You don't hear a lot about it, but if you're trying to compile a list or a playlist of great jazz funk numbers that really cut, this has to be one of them. Suitably for a song that you put in that category, it's got some great clavinet work by Phonse Mizell and some great wah guitar by either Rowan or Walker, one of the guitarists. It has a sweet breakdown, which I figure must have been sampled a million times, and when the instruments come back in, there is a kind of a spine-tingling moment, I feel, where just one of those moments where all the music comes together and you've got goosebumps in your arms, just like the concluding portions of Harlem River Drive on the previous side. The final song is Baby's Gone, which is the other song on which Bobbi Humphrey sings, and it is the only out-and-out ballad on the album. I love this not just because it's a great tune, but because the more spacious arrangement of a ballad allows you to focus a little bit more on the playing of the individual instruments, and the quality of the side people here is so great that it's really nice to be able to have that white space and pick out the different contributions. I also think Bobbi's solo here is probably the best one on the whole record. This is a wonderful record. It's either super cerebral and jazzy R&B or funked up vocal jazz, and I'm not really interested in parsing or taking sides. The vibe of the record is super positive, almost cheerful. The one slight asterisk, as I mentioned, is that this is as much a Mizell's record as it is a Bobbi Humphrey record. I do wish that she had had a little bit more opportunity to shine and maybe stamp herself a little bit more in the record than she does, but nonetheless, as a collective, it's a fantastic effort. It's a great snapshot into the way that musicians were mixing sounds and genres in that completely brilliant era for black music in the early part of the 1970s. And it's very much in the same class as the work being done by Donald Byrd and the Crusaders around the same time. For me, this record is 4.5 out of 5 stars.